The summer of 1945 had left the Pacific Islands scarred. Palms and bamboo groves were shattered by artillery, villages reduced to smouldering skeletons of wood and clay, and the air was thick with humidity and the lingering smell of fire. Amid the chaos, a small Allied POW camp had been hastily established on a remote island to house captured Japanese personnel. Among the captives were a group of young Japanese female nurses, including Aiko Tanaka, whose medical training had been dedicated to tending wounded soldiers across the Pacific campaigns. Aiko's capture had been sudden. During a chaotic retreat from a forward field hospital, she and several colleagues were surrounded by American patrols. Weapons raised, orders shouted, and the realization that escape was impossible hit her in a cold, sharp wave. She had prepared herself for the worst: harsh treatment, suspicion, or outright punishment. The enemy's reputation preceded them, and every captured nurse feared mistreatment. The camp itself was a crude collection of tents and makeshift shelters, surrounded by high fences and patrolled constantly. The nurses were assigned sleeping quarters with strict rules and minimal rations. Even in such conditions, Aiko's mind raced with observation. Which guards were lax, which patrols moved predictably, and how the layout of the camp might offer opportunities for protection or survival. She had learned to move carefully, to speak minimally, and to avoid drawing attention. The first days were marked by fear, discomfort, and isolation. The nurses were watched constantly, their routines dictated by armed soldiers. Aiko noted the tension in the air. Every misstep could result in punishment, and even small gestures of independence were scrutinized. Despite this, she instinctively began caring for weaker prisoners, tending small injuries or quietly providing comfort. It was a subtle seed of defiance, small, nearly invisible, but it reminded her that her professional duty did not end even in captivity. Then, unexpectedly, American medics entered the ward. Unlike the guards, these men were focused not on punishment but on care. One of them, Sergeant William Hayes, approached Aiko directly, his tone firm but respectful. "We need your help," he said. "Can you assist with triage?" Aiko froze. She had expected anger or contempt, not a request for collaboration from the enemy. The weight of disbelief pressed on her chest, yet the urgency of the situation forced her to act. Hours passed as wounded Japanese soldiers and civilians arrived from nearby skirmishes. Aiko, working alongside Sergeant Hayes and his team, was astonished to find trust and professional respect extended despite nationality. Orders were given and followed efficiently. Minor injuries were treated, shock victims stabilized, and the most critical received immediate attention. Every action had to be precise. Any mistake could draw suspicion or cause harm. Yet the atmosphere was one of collaboration, not hostility. Throughout the day, Aiko observed the medics' risk exposure. They moved into partially damaged structures, navigated open areas vulnerable to sniper fire, and repeatedly placed themselves between danger and the injured. Her initial disbelief slowly gave way to a deep respect. These men were risking their own lives to preserve others, including her. For the first time in days, she felt a fragile sense of safety and recognition of shared humanity, even as the war raged around them. By evening, the nurses had established a cautious rhythm. Small acts of care became routine, but always under vigilance. Aiko took note of every pattern: which medics were most empathetic, which guards were observant, and how to coordinate care without attracting unnecessary attention. Her professional skills were not only acknowledged but essential, making her a valued participant rather than a passive captive. As night fell, the nurses huddled in their bunks, exhausted yet quietly exhilarated. They had survived the first day under enemy control without harm, and had begun to experience something entirely unexpected: the humanity of those they were taught to fear. Aiko's thoughts oscillated between gratitude, disbelief, and cautious hope. In the middle of a war defined by cruelty and suffering, She had witnessed courage and ethical action in its purest form. The dawn of the second day in the POW camp brought with it a new wave of terror. The distant sound of artillery punctuated the humid morning air, echoing across the flattened landscape surrounding the camp. Civilians and soldiers alike were being evacuated from recently bombarded villages, many gravely injured, some barely conscious. Aiko Tanaka, still reeling from the surreal events of the previous day, knew that the challenges would intensify. The calm she had briefly felt was fragile. Each moment in the camp carried the possibility of sudden catastrophe. American medics, led by Sergeant William Hayes, coordinated the triage of incoming casualties. Their movements were swift but deliberate, a mix of practiced routine and instinctive responsiveness. Aiko worked alongside them, her hands moving with precision as she treated wounds, bandaged injuries, and stabilized shock victims. Each patient was a test of endurance, both physically and mentally, for the nurses and medics alike. Despite the chaos, a remarkable sense of coordination emerged, an unspoken partnership between former enemies, united by the imperative to save life. As more wounded arrived, the dangers increased. One of the tents housing the critically injured collapsed slightly under uneven snow and wind, threatening to crush patients and equipment. Hayes and a small team of medics rushed to stabilize it, deliberately positioning themselves between the collapsing structure and the injured. Aiko's heart pounded as she assisted, realizing fully that these men were risking their lives to protect both their charges and the nurses. The act was an overwhelming lesson in moral courage, the enemy demonstrating heroism in ways she had never imagined. The nurses were both awed and conflicted. Fear still coursed through their veins. A sudden misstep, a moment of distraction, could provoke punishment or death. Yet, alongside fear, a burgeoning sense of trust and gratitude began to take hold. Aiko found herself quietly marveling at the medics' ability to operate with calm precision, to place humanity above protocol, and to protect life regardless of nationality. The moral tension of the situation, working under armed captors while simultaneously being protected and respected by them, weighed heavily on her, yet reinforced the importance of vigilance and ethical action. The day's most harrowing moment arrived when a fresh group of casualties was brought in from a nearby skirmish. Several soldiers were critically injured, their wounds severe, and the tent space was limited. The American medics worked furiously, improvising stretchers from debris and coordinating with Aiko and her fellow nurses to prioritize care. Each decision was a moral and logistical calculus: who needed immediate attention, which resources to allocate, and how to maintain safety for all. The nurses' expertise became indispensable, and their collaboration with the Americans reached a level of cohesion that blurred the lines between prisoner and medic. In a tense corridor of the field hospital, a critically injured child arrived, alone and terrified. Aiko knelt beside him, murmuring comforting words in Japanese, while Hayes administered emergency care. Bullets ricocheted faintly outside, and a shell struck near the perimeter, sending dust and debris into the room. The nurses and medics worked in tandem, shielding the child, stabilizing injuries, and moving patients to safer areas. Every movement carried risk, yet their professionalism and courage held firm. As the day wore on, Aiko observed the subtle dangers the medics themselves faced. They moved into open spaces, past watchful sentries, and sometimes under the threat of renewed artillery. Every action they took on behalf of the nurses and civilians was deliberate, brave, and morally courageous. Aiko realized that their protection extended beyond professional respect. It was a conscious, life-threatening effort to preserve those they could, regardless of who they were. Fatigue pressed heavily on everyone by late afternoon. Aiko's hands trembled from constant bandaging. Her face was streaked with soot and blood. Yet she persisted, driven by the urgent needs of the injured and by the extraordinary example set by the American medics. Each patient saved was a reinforcement of trust, each coordinated effort a testament to shared humanity. The nurses' understanding of the moral complexity of their situation deepened. Survival in this environment required vigilance, courage, and ethical decisiveness. As night descended, the POW camp settled into an uneasy quiet. Snow drifted over the shattered village streets, and the faint glow of lanterns illuminated the makeshift wards. Aiko and her colleagues moved quietly among the wounded, checking vital signs, providing comfort, and assisting medics with last-minute interventions. The bond forged between the Japanese nurses and American medics was undeniable, built on mutual reliance, shared risk, and the recognition that humanity and professionalism could transcend even the deepest divides of war. Night fell over the shattered village with a cold wind sweeping through the remains of flattened huts and debris-littered streets. Aiko Tanaka and her fellow Japanese nurses moved cautiously through the camp, guided by lantern light and the soft murmur of American medics coordinating care. The day had been exhausting. Bodies had been treated, lives stabilized, yet the threat of renewed attacks and patrolling guards lingered in the shadows. Despite the exhaustion, Aiko felt a strange mix of fear, disbelief, and awe. Her captors had consistently placed themselves in harm's way to protect her and the civilians she aided. A sudden alarm shattered the fragile calm. Distant gunfire erupted from a nearby skirmish, echoing across the village ruins. Civilians and soldiers scrambled for cover, and chaos threatened to overwhelm the camp. Aiko, heart racing, rushed to assist in the makeshift ward. Sergeant William Hayes, the American medic who had become her ally and guide, barked commands while positioning medics and nurses to protect the most critical casualties. Together they moved as a seamless unit, a combination of skill, courage, and instinct forged under extreme pressure. One of the most harrowing moments came when a partially collapsed building, housing several critically injured civilians, began to cave. Hayes and two medics charged toward the danger, ignoring the risk of debris and potential sniper fire. Aiko followed, directing her fellow nurses to stabilize patients and prepare for evacuation. Every action was precise, every second a battle against death itself. She marveled at the courage of these men, strangers just hours before, now risking everything to save lives she had once feared would be treated with hostility. As the night wore on, casualties continued to arrive, their injuries severe and resources stretched thin. Aiko assisted with triage, bandaging wounds, and providing comfort to terrified civilians. Children clung to her uniform, women sought guidance, and men looked to her expertise for reassurance. Through it all, the American medics deferred to her judgment, trusting her knowledge despite her nationality. The dynamic was surreal, enemies in war, yet allies in humanity. Fatigue threatened to cripple them, but the nurses and medics pressed on. Aiko's hands were raw, her back aching, and exhaustion pressed like a heavy stone against her chest. Yet every time she looked at the people around her, the patients, the medics, her fellow nurses, she found renewed determination. Their survival depended on courage, skill, and unwavering ethical commitment. These moments, she realized, were far more than a test of endurance. They were a crucible of morality and human decency in the midst of war. A critical decision arose when another group of civilians arrived from a nearby destroyed village. Some were too injured to move, and the path to safety required crossing exposed streets under sporadic artillery fire. Hayes consulted with Aiko. Together they coordinated a plan. The nurses would stabilize the civilians while the medics provided cover and moved the most critical patients. The operation required absolute trust and precision. One misstep could be fatal. Yet they executed the plan flawlessly, each action a testament to courage and collaboration beyond national boundaries. As the first light of dawn broke over the ruins, Aiko paused, surveying the camp. Survivors had been treated, the critically injured stabilized, and temporary shelters reinforced. She reflected on the past days, the terror of capture, the near-constant threat of death, and the overwhelming fear she had felt upon entering the POW camp. Now, gratitude and respect for the American medics replaced that fear. They had not only preserved lives, but also demonstrated that morality and bravery could transcend the artificial barriers of war. Weeks later, as the nurses were gradually integrated into safer facilities and provided with supplies and better care, the memory of those critical nights remained vivid. Aiko had endured extreme physical and psychological stress, but she had also witnessed extraordinary heroism and compassion. The experience had reshaped her understanding of courage, morality, and human connection in ways she could never have imagined. By the time the nurses were fully liberated, they had not only survived captivity, but had also seen a profound truth, that even amidst the brutality of war, acts of empathy, courage, and moral clarity could shine brighter than any battlefield victory. Aiko Tanaka emerged alive, skilled, and profoundly changed, carrying with her the enduring lesson that humanity can persist even in the darkest circumstances.